Phantom Hiker of Grandfather Mountain. When the guys proposed we take a day hike on Grandfather Mountain, I agreed with enthusiasm. Grandfather Mountain looms craggily over the scenery just a few miles from my hometown. It is 5,946 feet in elevation, has a mile-high swinging bridge, fantastic views of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the best day hikes in the region. It was some place. Grandfather Mountain got its name from the distinct formations on its top. From Highway 105, you could clearly see the profile of an old man with a long beard and a strong nose napping with his head tilted back. I couldn't think of a better way to spend a Saturday afternoon. I packed up my day pack and the hiking gear I would need for the day and ran out the front door when I heard my friend honking the car horn. It was a perfect day, clear and sunny and warm, though the wind at mountain top would be chilly. Brian, Jerry, and I arranged to have a couple friends drop us off at the trailhead and leave our car in the parking lot up top since we were getting a late start and figured we'd never make it back down the mountain before dark. And only the very foolish hike on Grandfather Mountain after dark. It's a dangerous mountain. We decided to hike up to the Callaway Peak and via the Profile Trail, which goes right up over the Grandfather's face. We paid for hiking day passes and our buddy dropped us off at the trailhead. Donning our packs, we set off on our adventure. One of the reasons I love hiking Grandfather Mountain is because the backcountry is so different from other areas in the south. The trails take you through forests usually found in Canadian climates, and you get to see some rare and endangered plants during your travels. According to the guidebooks, there are 16 distinct ecosystems on Grandfather Mountain. Jogging along wooded pathways, picking our way cautiously up steep inclines, and pausing to take in magnificent views, the day passed quickly. When we reached the peak, we paused for a while to eat some snacks and take photos. During our break, the talk turned, as it always did when we climbed Grandfather Mountain, to the various stories connected with the place. Grandfather Mountain had a special place in Cherokee mythology. It was called Tanawa, Fabulous Eagle, and was once considered the resting place of the evil spirit. It was also thought that there were entrances to the underworld on Grandfather Mountain that were marked by a spring head and guarded by the little people as well as a black panther. As we passed out granola bars, Jerry laughingly mentioned that we had walked through one of the places where the Phantom Hiker had been reported. Brian perked up then. He loves ghost stories. He demanded details, but Jerry had none to give. So I told him the tale as I had heard it from other folks hiking in the region. Apparently, there was a stretch of trail, folks disagreed on which one, where a hiker would appear. The man would tramp past his viewers without acknowledging their nods or greetings and then would vanish into thin air. Folks thought the phantom must be a hiker, must be a mountain man who had died somewhere near here and had returned, refused to leave after death. Others thought he must be a long-ago explorer who fell off the mountain while hiking. It wasn't much of a story, really, but Jerry lapped it up. It was getting late, and we needed to hustle. I did not want to tackle some of those trickier trails at dusk. Packing up, we headed back down the trail. We reached a wide-open rocky stretch that was fairly difficult to navigate. As we headed along the trail in the direction of the upper parking lot where our buddies had left the car, a tall, gruff fellow with a craggy face and a beard hiked past us. He was wearing old-fashioned clothing and had a rough sort of pack on his back. He didn't look at us as he approached and did not acknowledge our nods of greeting as he passed us. He must be hiking all the way down to the bottom of the mountain, which was just plain foolish because there was no way he could reach the trailhead before dusk. Jerry must have had the same thought. He nudged me as the man passed us and said, "He'll never make it to the bottom before dark. We should offer him a ride to his car." I nodded and we both turned to call to the hiker. He had vanished. I stared blankly at the wide-open, rocky surface of the mountain. The tree line was at least 500 feet away on all sides. Where had the hiker gone? I shuddered superstitiously. Vanished into thin air is a hackneyed phrase that is overused in book and movies. I hated to use it, but in this instance, that is just what the hiker had done. He had disappeared. Jerry's eyes were huge as he glanced nervously back and forth along the rocky hilltop. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide on this rocky section of trail. So where was the hiker? He glanced questioningly at me, his face pale. Brian, who had continued a little way down the path, stopped now and called to us, "Come on, guys. Why are you stopping? Where did that hiker go?" I asked, gesturing to the empty rocky ground around us. "He passed us a few seconds ago, and there's nowhere to hide. He can't have reached the tree line. There was no time. We turned around with 2 or 3 seconds after he passed us," Jerry said. "Maybe it was the phantom," Brian called back to us, a little sarcastically. My arms broke out in goosebumps at the thought. "Come on," he added. "We can tell the rangers to look out for him when we get back to the car." We nodded reluctantly, gave the bare rocky hilltop another disbelieving scan, and hurried after Brian. It was getting late when we reached the car. We put our packs into the trunk and then found the nearest ranger to tell him about the late hiker tramping down the long trail to the bottom of the mountain. The ranger promised to keep an eye out for him. We thanked the ranger and headed for home, still a bit spooked by the whole occurrence. Had we really seen the phantom hiker? Or had the man simply been really, really fast? I checked in with the ranger the next day to see if the man had been found, but the ranger had seen no one on his sweep of the mountain. The hiker had vanished without a trace. So it remains a mystery to this day. Did we see the phantom hiker of Grandfather Mountain? I think so. What do you think? Phantom drummer. Now when Colonel Howell of the British Army chanced to meet the daughter of the wealthy farmer Jarrett, who owned land near Valley Forge, he fell head over heels in love. Howell had a bit of a reputation as a womanizer, but it faded away after he met Ruth. The girl had a brother serving under Washington, and none of her family liked the red coats, but so overwhelming was Howell's love for her that it conquered the reluctant maiden's heart. Ruth and her British soldier met in a secret place near the wall of her garden, which was hidden by a small grove of trees. On the night that Howell proposed, they were standing near the wall when the sharp, merry sound of a drummer rang through the garden. At first they ignored the noise, caught up in their plans for the future, but as the sound of the drum grew nearer, Howell started looking about nervously and even peering over the wall, trying to see the drummer. Ruth was puzzled by Howell's reaction. No one could see them in this little grove, which was why they used it for their trysts. "What is wrong?" she cried, hurrying to him. "There is no one there," Howell told Ruth hoarsely. Ruth stared at him, frightened by his words. The roll of the drum still rang through the fields beyond the wall. "But surely," she began. She was interrupted by a phantom rat-a-tat-tat. The sound drew closer. As they listened in horror, it came right through the garden gate just beyond the trees. The invisible drummer entered their little hollow and passed right through the wall next to them. Only when it ceased altogether did Howell snap out of the fear-induced trance he was in. He convulsively clasped Ruth to his chest. No less frightened, Ruth begged Howell to tell her what it could mean. "For the last 3 generations," Howell said shakily, "a phantom drummer has appeared to warn my family of a change in fortunes, some for good, most for ill." Seeing the look on Ruth's face, he tried to shake off his terror. He spoke a few words of reassurance to his newly betrothed, which neither of them believed, kissed her goodbye, and galloped away. In a skirmish the next day, Colonel Howell was shot. He was brought to Farmer Jarrett's house for nursing, though Ruth's father was reluctant to have a British soldier under his roof. To Ruth's relief, the wound was fairly minor and would soon heal. To add to her joy, her father grew fond of the young man and consented to their marriage if Howell would leave the British Army. The colonel made this promise willingly, and a secret marriage was soon arranged. Then tragedy struck. Orders arrived demanding that Howell rejoin his regiment on the eve of an impending battle. Howell knew that to honorably resign his commission would take months, and he would be forced to fight and kill the Americans in the battle the next day. So he decided to marry Ruth, desert the British Army, and hide himself away until it was safe to rejoin the Jarrett household. Divesting himself of the British uniform, he donned the clothes of a civilian and stood with Ruth before a minister in the parlor of the Jarrett house. As he slipped the wedding ring on his beloved's finger and bent to kiss her, the roll of a drum sounded from outside. Howell and Ruth turned fearfully and listened as the invisible drummer climbed the steps, walked through the room, and exited via the far wall. Ruth clung to her new husband in terror, while the guests and clergy murmured in awe. Then they heard rough voices outside and someone pounded on the front door. Suddenly the house was full of British soldiers, come to capture Howell based on the testimony of one of the Jarrett servants who hated the red coats and had betrayed them. Howell was arrested, tried, and shot for desertion. At the moment he died, Ruth, sobbing alone in her bedchamber at home, heard the faint, unmistakable roll of a phantom drum. Phantom lovers of Dismal Swamp. He couldn't believe it when she fell just a few short weeks before their marriage. His betrothed was beautiful, strong, and healthy, but she just faded away before his eyes. He held her in his arms as she gasped out her last breath and was inconsolable long after her body lay buried beside the Dismal Swamp. Day after day, night after night, he grieved for his lost love. He scorned food and sleep, depriving himself until his mind gave way under the strain and he became obsessed with the idea that his beloved was still alive somewhere just out of reach. Her family had sent her away into the swamp, he reasoned, and she was waiting for him to come and rescue her. "I will find her," he told his worried family, passionate in his conviction. "I will find her and hide her away from death, so that he will never find her when he comes." In vain, his family tried to convince him that his beloved lay dead beside the swamp. He would listen to none of their pleas, breaking away from them violently and plunging into the swamp. He wandered for days, living on roots and berries and sleeping at night among the dank marshland. One evening at dusk, he stumbled upon Drummond's Pond, which was a 5-mile expanse of water in the middle of the Dismal Swamp. Upon the surface of the water, he saw the soft blinking of a firefly dancing hither and thither across the black surface. "It is her," he exclaimed in joy. "I see her light." He rushed around, frantically constructing a raft of cypress branches so that he could reach his love before she disappeared. Lashing the branches together with vines, he leapt on top and floated out to join the girl he had lost. As he drew near the center of the pond, a wind sprang up and the raft was tossed and tumbled in the sudden waves it caused. With a cry of alarm, he fell from the raft, sank down into the murky waters, and was drowned. If you visit Drummond's Pond after the last light fades and the fireflies come out, you may sometimes see the phantoms of the man and his love reunited at last. Side by side, they float across the pond on a raft made of cypress branches, carrying a firefly lantern to light their way. Phantom train wreck. The passengers were grumpy and heavy-eyed as they boarded the train in Salisbury during the early morning of August 27, 1891. The train was headed to Asheville, and the riders settled into their seats and tried to catch a few more minutes of sleep. Around 3 a.m., the passengers were suddenly awakened by suddenly bucking and rocking of the train. The engineer fought for control as the passenger train raced across the stony and brick Boston Bridge near Statesville, but the train suddenly derailed. The chug and whoosh of the rushing train was replaced by the scream of metal and the sounds of the huge train falling down towards the creek bed 60 feet below the bridge. The horrible thunder of the train as it smashed into the stream was quickly replaced by the equally terrible sound of trapped passengers screaming and moaning in agony as the twisted wreckage of the train was encompassed by the waters of the creek. 22 people were killed that night in the worst train wreck in the history of North Carolina. 50 years to the day after the wreck, a woman waiting by her stranded car near the Boston Bridge in the early morning hours of August 27th saw a train come rushing down the track, its headlight gleaming brightly in the darkness and the whistle blowing. As it raced across the bridge, it suddenly derailed, screaming its way down and down 60 feet to smash into the creek bed below. The woman was terrified. She ran toward the wrecked train and gazed down into the creek. She could hear the frantic cries and agonized moans of the survivors. At that moment, a car pulled up beside her stranded vehicle and her husband jumped out, followed by the owner of a local store who had come to help them fix their flat tire. She ran towards them in a frenzy, desperate to get help down to the poor trapped passengers below. When they heard her story, the men ran to the edge and looked down into the creek bed. There was nothing there. The woman had seen the train wreck of Statesville reenacted before her eyes. Some people say the phantom train appears each year in the early morning hours of August 27th and is wrecked before the eyes of any who watch for it. Piece by piece. There once was a crazy ghost over Poughkeepsie Way that got folks so plumb scared that nobody would stay more than one night in its house. It was a nice old place, or was, until the ghost began making its presence known. It got so no one would enter the house, not even kids on a dare, and you know what they are like. Now when my friend Joe heard a fancy old house in Poughkeepsie was selling dirt cheap, he decided to go have a look. He asked me about it and I told him about the spook, but Joe just laughed. "I don't believe in ghosts," he said, and went to visit the agent selling the house. Well, the agent gave Joe a key, but refused to look at the old house with him, which should have told Joe something. But Joe's a stubborn man who won't listen to reason. He even waited until after dark to visit the house for the first time, just to prove his point. Joe got to the house around 9 p.m. and he entered the front hallway. It was a large entrance and well-proportioned, but neglected looking, with creepy cobwebs and dust everywhere. As Joe paused near the door to get his bearings, he heard a thump from the top of the staircase facing him. A glowing leg appeared out of nowhere and rolled down the steps, landing right next to Joe's feet. Joe gasped out loud and stood frozen to the spot. An arm appeared and rolled down to meet the leg. Next came a foot, then another arm, then a hand. Glowing pieces of body kept popping into existence and plummeting down the steps towards Joe. Joe held his ground a lot longer than anyone else ever had, but when a screaming head appeared at the top of the steps and started rolling towards him, Joe had had enough. With a shriek that could wake the dead, those that weren't already up and haunting the house, that is, Joe ran for his life, out of the house, out of the street, and right out of town, leaving his car behind him. He called me the next day and asked me to drive his car down to the hotel where he had spent the night. Joe was headed back to Manhattan and refused to come within 50 miles of Poughkeepsie ever again. The agent gave up trying to sell the house after that, and the house fell into ruin and was eventually torn down. Pink. She was always in the garden. Day after day after day. It drove him crazy. Supper never came when he wanted it, and he had to go outside and kneel down in the dirt every dabbling time he wanted to have a conversation with his wife. When he complained, she told him to get his own supper. She knew he couldn't boil water without burning it. The garden wasn't the only thing that drove him crazy. His wife also loved the color pink. She wore something pink every dabbling day of her life, and most of the flowers in the garden were pink. "Choose another color," he yelled one day. So what color did she choose? Mauve. One day, his wife started complaining about her knees. She wanted an assistant to help her in the garden. "Why do you need an assistant?" he grumbled at her. "Do you want to help me?" she retorted. "Heck no," he replied, and told her to go ahead and hire a gardener. He didn't expect the handsome young fellow who showed up the next day to help his wife in the garden. The fellow had a charming manner that sent at his wife laughing and fluffing up her hair as they talked. That drove him really crazy. Some folks might think it was natural for her to find the new gardener charming. But he wondered. He started coming home early from work to spy on his wife and the new gardener. They were always laughing together as they worked. He didn't like it. Then his wife went out and bought a brand new red lipstick, though she'd only ever bought pink lipstick before, and got her hair cut in a new style. That really made him suspicious. He spoke to the new gardener one afternoon while his wife was out. The young man denied that there was any hanky-panky going on, but he knew better and fired the gardener on the spot. At supper that night, he confronted his wife with his suspicions. "I'm not having an affair," she retorted, "but if you keep this up, he could get lucky." Her smart reply filled him with rage. His vision went red and misty as his hands closed around his wife's neck and he started shaking her. It was several minutes before he calmed down enough to realize he was shaking a ragdoll figure that was no longer breathing. He dropped his wife's dead body on the floor in horror, realizing what he'd done and what would happen to him if he were caught. Fortunately, the dirt was always disturbed around his house because of his wife's incessant gardening, so he dumped his wife's body into a flower bed and covered the grave mound with pink flower seedlings. End of problem. He closed the house the next day, telling the neighbors that they were going north to be near his wife's ailing sister, and put the house on the market to be sold. When 7 years had passed without suspicion, he decided it was safe to come home. He got an apartment and told folks that his wife had left him some time ago. But he was frightened of discovery and wanted to know if his wife was still buried in the flower bed of his former house. Waiting for the new owners to leave for the weekend, he slipped into the garden at dusk to look for the grave. To his horror, he saw the old mound was still there and was still planted with pink flowers. Only now, the pink flowers formed the shape of a woman. Trembling, he dug a deep, narrow hole into the mound, feeling for his wife's bones. But her body was gone. Alarmed, he made discreet inquiries and was told that the new owners had found a family gravesite on their property and had the grave moved to the local cemetery. He felt a surge of relief at this explanation, but morbid curiosity sent him along to the cemetery to check on the truth of the tale. He searched for a long time, looking for a grave with no name. Then he caught a glimmer of pink and his pulses started pounding. Could it be? Yes, there was a narrow grave covered with pink flowers. It had no name attached to it, and he knew it was her. In that moment, his vision was clouded once again by a red mist. He lurched as he was suddenly overwhelmed by a massive heart attack, and his helpless body tumbled down among the pink flowers as the whole world went dark. His last thought was of a dead ragdoll figure that had once been his wife. After the authorities found and removed the dead body, the flowers crushed by his fall never grew back on the unmarked grave. Each spring, the unmarked tomb is covered with pink blossoms, but the flowers never grow in the blackened, body-shaped space where the murderer's body lay. And in the house where the couple once lived, the pink flowers on the empty grave mound still grow each spring in the shape of a woman's body, no matter how many times the owners have rooted them out.